All right, so buckle up, everybody, because we're about to dive into some seriously challenging ideas about African history. You've given us this amazing interview from way back in 1987 with Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan, who was an anthropologist, and Dr. George Simmonds, a professor.
Yeah, and these two, they really don't hold back. They're like taking aim at how we usually think about history, especially when it comes to Africans being in the Americas.
Oh, absolutely. Right off the bat, they just dropped this huge claim that could completely rewrite history as we think we know it. I mean, they're saying Africans were in the Americas way before Columbus, like potentially over 2,000 years earlier.
Yeah, no kidding. And they even have some evidence for this, like they talk about Carthaginian coins that were found buried deep underground in Central and South America. And, well, Carthage was destroyed by the Romans in 212 BC, so finding these coins suggests someone was there much earlier.
Yeah, 200 feet underground. They weren't just like, passing through and drop some change. This was like, suggests a real, maybe even settlements or trade routes or something,
Exactly. It really challenges the whole idea that Columbus discovered America. It opens up this whole other world of possibilities about like who was really here first and what they were doing.
It's incredible. And speaking of assumptions, the interview goes into the Olmec civilization. The ones that are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Mm-hmm. Dr. Ben-Jochannan, he really pushes for them having African origins.
Oh, yeah, he's very clear about that. He talks about the features of the Olmec colossal heads, like the giant statues, saying that they clearly show African ancestry. And he even addresses like the counter arguments, Some people say that the Olmecs didn't have the tools to carve more European-looking features. But Dr. Ben-Jochannan, he's like, look at the eyelids on those statues. Like, they're so detailed. If they could carve eyelids like that, why not noses?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it really makes you think, right? Like, what other details are we missing? And how are these little biases shaping our whole view of history?
Absolutely. And this leads them to talk about how we see, like, figures from the Bible. Mm-hmm. They use this example of the Queen of Sheba, who, she actually describes herself as black in the Song of Solomon. But if you look at how she's usually depicted, it's rarely that way.
It's like history has literally been, well, whitewashed in some cases. It's really striking.
Yeah, it is. And Dr. Ben-Jochannan, he suggests this is because of the Council of Nicaea back in 325 AD, where the Roman Emperor Constantine basically took control of Christianity and kind of steered it away from its African roots.
Right.
To solidify his power,
So you're saying the story of Christianity, which is followed by, billions of people today, it might have been rewritten for political reasons? That's wild.
Well, that's the argument, yeah. And they even question figures like Moses and the Ten Commandments. Dr. Ben-Jochannan points out that Moses, since he was raised in Egypt, he would have known about the Egyptian negative confessions, which were these 32 laws that came before the Ten Commandments. He thinks that Moses took 10 of these and kind of presented them as this new divine revelation.
Hold on, the negative confessions. I've never even heard of those.
Yeah, so they're basically these ethical guidelines from ancient Egypt, sort of like a moral code,
Yeah.
And they're pretty similar to the Ten Commandments when you look at them.
Which makes you wonder, if Moses was raised in Egypt, surrounded by these laws, where did the Ten Commandments really come from? It's fascinating.
Right. It's like, where did this knowledge really begin? And it shows how deep this influence of African knowledge was on later civilizations. They even bring up Imhotep, the Egyptian polymath who lived like way before Moses, over 2,000 years before.
Oh, yeah, Imhotep. Wasn't he like an architect and a physician?
Yeah.
And basically a genius in everything.
Yeah, that's the one. And his medical knowledge, it was so advanced for his time, and it was adopted by the Greeks, even Hippocrates, who we usually call the father of medicine, But Imhotep, he came first.
Wow. So much of what we attribute to the ancient Greeks might actually come from Africa. And speaking of medical knowledge, Dr. Ben-Jochannan, he talks about finding all these medical papyri in Egypt, dating back to 1700 BC, long before Hippocrates.
Oh, yeah, and these papyri. They're full of information about women's health and pregnancy, and it shows like a really sophisticated understanding of medicine that predates what we usually think of as the start of Western medicine.
It's like this idea of ancient Greece being the only source of knowledge just crumbles.
Yeah.
It points to this much older and richer source of knowledge in Africa.
Yeah, totally. And it wasn't just medicine either. They talk about how Greek philosophers like Homer and Plato might have even gotten their education in Egypt.
So they're suggesting that Western civilization as we know it, it's actually built on a foundation of African knowledge.
Yeah.
That we just ignore or downplay.
That's exactly what Dr. Ben-Jochannan and Dr. Simmonds are saying. They want us to rethink the whole narrative of Western civilization and really understand the contributions of Africa.
It's a huge shift in thinking. And then, just when you think they've shaken things up enough, Dr. Ben-Jochannan, he drops another bombshell. He goes after the Bible itself.
Yeah, he does. He says that the Bible, especially the King James Version, it isn't really a collection of facts, but more like a collection of versions put together by 47 men who were hired by King James. And he even says that earlier versions of the Bible, they had this passage describing the descendants of Canaan as ugly and black and destined for servitude, but that it was taken out in the 6th century A.D.
Oh. I can only imagine how some listeners would react to that. I mean, that's challenging some really deeply held beliefs. It's got to make people uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure. But I think that discomfort, that's kind of what the scholars are going for. They want us to question everything, to dig deeper and not just take things at face value.
Because if we don't question, if we don't critically examine what we're told, then are we really thinking for ourselves? Or are we just stuck in this limited worldview?
Exactly. And that brings us to another controversial part of the interview, their critique of organized religion.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. They don't hold back at all when it comes to their opinions on religion, especially when it comes to Black preachers.
Yeah, they're calling out what they see as hypocrisy, especially with some Black preachers who, they preach about humility and sacrifice, but then they live these lavish lifestyles, all paid for by the people in their congregations who are often struggling financially.
They basically call it a business, a system that's meant to make money from people's faith, not to actually provide spiritual guidance. That's a tough thing to hear for a lot of people.
It is, but it also makes us ask these hard questions, like who really benefits from blind faith? Who's controlling the narrative? How do we make sure that our spiritual practices are actually in line with our values and our search for truth?
It's all about taking back control, isn't it? Not just over our history, but over our spirituality too. To be critical thinkers, to be discerning, and to shape the world around us.
It's really interesting, how this interview keeps coming back to this idea of perspective. Like, whose stories are we hearing and whose voices are being left out? And how does the way we look at history shape how we see the world today?
Yeah, it's like we're looking at this puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
And those missing pieces, they could totally change the whole picture.
Exactly. And Dr. Ben-Jochannan and Dr. Simmonds, they're saying that the way we usually see history, especially in the West, it's got this huge blind spot when it comes to Africa.
Like it downplays or distorts or even just ignores all these contributions of African civilizations.
Right. And they say this Eurocentric perspective, it can really affect like how African Americans see themselves. If you accept this limited story, they say it can lead to feeling inferior, like a kind of mental slavery that just keeps these cycles of oppression going.
It's like this invisible barrier. You know, if you're always told that your history is just about savagery and being dependent on others, how can you really see your own potential?
It's subtle, but it's so powerful. And that's why Dr. Ben-Jochannan and Dr. Simmonds are calling for this huge shift in perspective. They want African Americans to reclaim their history, to find those untold stories, and to really celebrate what their ancestors achieved.
And it's not just about pride, right? It's about empowerment. It's about understanding your real place in history, a place of innovation and resilience.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that African civilizations, they weren't just, sitting there waiting for knowledge to come to them. They were actively contributing to the very foundation of things like math, science, philosophy, art, you name it.
Didn't they even say that Africans invented the bra? I remember reading that somewhere.
They did. They use it as this example of the ingenuity and practicality of African cultures. Now, whether or not that specific claim is true, who knows? But it makes their point. African history is full of creativity and innovation, and we need to rewrite the story to show that. It takes us back to the power of education. And I don't just mean degrees in schools. I mean knowledge, critical thinking, self-discovery, all of that.
They really push people to read widely, to do their own research, and to have these open discussions and debates. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about about loving to learn.
It's about realizing that real education, it gives you the power to question things, to challenge things, and to tell your own story, free from all those limits of dogma and other people's perspectives.
It's about seeing learning as a journey, not just a destination. A journey that's going to have twists and turns, and sometimes it'll take you to uncomfortable places.
Exactly. And sometimes those uncomfortable places, those are where we grow the most, where we have to confront our biases and our assumptions and come out of it with this deeper understanding of ourselves and the world.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
Wow.
So much history and perspectives that really challenge the way we usually think about things. But we're not done yet. Stick with us for part 3, where we'll wrap up this whole exploration of challenging these historical narratives. Man, we have covered so much in this deep dive. Ancient Egypt, the Americas, how we see the Bible, even organized religion today. I mean, it's just incredible how much information and different ways of looking at things were packed into just this one interview.
Yeah, it really shows you how much there is to learn about African history and how much of it gets left out of the story we usually hear.
It really does. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, honestly, just how important it is to look for those different perspectives, to question what we've always been told and really try to get a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the past.
Because that understanding of the past, it shapes how we see things now and how we think about the future. If we're holding on to these limited or distorted stories, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycles of ignorance and prejudice and inequality.
That's a great point. And it brings us back to that call to action that Dr. Ben-Jochannan and Dr. Ben-Jochannan were talking about. They really want African Americans to go beyond just passively listening and to actually take back their history.
Yeah, to search for those hidden stories, to challenge the dominant narrative and to create a more, empowering and authentic representation of African history and culture.
And I think this isn't just for African Americans either. It's for all of us, no matter our background, to be more critical in how we think, more curious about the world, and more active in shaping a world that values truth and justice and equality.
Because this fight against erasing history, it's not just about getting the facts right. It's about justice. It's about recognition and representation and dismantling these systems of oppression that were built on centuries of distorted narratives.
And it's a fight that needs everyone to participate, to read, to research, to have those hard conversations, and to lift up the voices that have been silenced for way too long.
Absolutely. It's about realizing that history isn't, set in stone. It's this living narrative that's always being shaped and reshaped by the people who have the power to tell the story. And we need to make sure those stories reflect how rich and complex human experience really is.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of urgency, but also hope. Urgency, because there's still so much work to do to tear down those systems of oppression built on these false narratives, but also hope, because I see more and more people who are dedicated to uncovering the truth and challenging things and creating a more just and equal world.
Yeah, and that's what makes these deep dives so powerful. They're not just about learning new things, they're about taking action, about finding that passion for truth and realizing we all have the power to make a difference in our own lives and in the world.
So, as we leave this conversation, we want to leave you with one final thought to think about. If history is really written by the winners, like they say, whose stories are missing from how we understand the world?
And how would hearing those untold stories change our perspective, our beliefs, even our actions? Think about that as you continue your own exploration. And we'll include links to all the resources we talked about so you can do some digging yourself. Until next time, happy exploring.
Rhythm and rhyme. From the past, your light will shine. Oh, Africa, forever divine. To ocean's call, your legacy echoes standing tall. Forgotten voices, now we sing Africa's truth, let freedom ring. Oh, Africa, heartbeat of time. Stories unveiled in rhythm and rhyme. Africa, forever divine.